South Park has been on the air since August 13th, 1997. 28 seasons, 338 episodes, a $1.5 billion deal with Paramount Global that guarantees the show will keep running through at least 2030. In nearly 3 decades of television, Trey Parker and Matt Stone have gone after every president, every religion, every political movement, every cultural trend, and every celebrity foolish enough to land in their crosshairs. They have been protested by the Catholic League, investigated by the FCC, and banned outright in multiple countries around the world. Their show was the first weekly television program in American history to carry a TVMA rating from the very first episode. They once aired an episode that used the word shit, uncensored, 162 times in 22 minutes. And nobody pulled the plug, but in all those years, across all those hundreds of episodes, only 5 have been erased. 5 episodes so controversial that Comedy Central, HBO Max, and Paramount Plus have all refused to make them available. You cannot stream them, you cannot find them in reruns, you cannot watch them on the official South Park website. In some cases, you cannot even buy them on DVD without the content being censored beyond recognition. And these episodes were not pulled because they were offensive. Everything on South Park is offensive. That is the entire point of the show. These 5 episodes were pulled because they triggered real-world death threats and one of the most significant censorship battles in the history of modern American television. But the story does not stop there. Beyond those 5 erased episodes, the show has been banned entirely in countries like China, India, and Sri Lanka, each for different reasons and each telling its own story about the limits of satire. Tonight, we are going to go through every single banned and censored episode, what they were about, why they were made, what happened when they aired, and why, to this day, you still cannot watch some of them legally anywhere on the planet. Before we get into it, I just want to say that if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, subscribing really does help the channel out. It is completely free, and it helps us keep making videos like this one. Alright, with that said, let us get into it. To understand why these episodes were banned, you first have to understand something fundamental about South Park itself. This is not a show that accidentally stumbled into controversy. Controversy is baked into the DNA of this series at the molecular level. It was controversial before it was even a television show. It was controversial on its very first day. And it has been controversial every single day since. The show was designed from the ground up to push buttons, cross lines, and force conversations that nobody else on television was willing to have. So when we talk about the banned episodes, we are not talking about a show that went too far one day and got punished for it. We are talking about a show that lived on the razor's edge for nearly 30 years, and the handful of times the world actually pushed back hard enough to make something disappear. The whole thing started with a homemade short film. Back in 1995, a Hollywood executive named Brian Graydon paid Trey Parker and Matt Stone around $2,000 to create an animated video Christmas card he could send to friends. Parker and Stone made a crude animated short called The Spirit of Christmas, which depicted Jesus Christ and Santa Claus in a bloody, violent fight to the death over the true meaning of the holiday. The animation was made using actual construction paper cutouts, stop-motion style. It was rough, it was ugly, and it was hilarious in the most inappropriate way possible. Graydon sent it to his friends copied it and sent it to their friends. Those people copied it again and sent it further. Within weeks, the short was being passed around on bootleg VHS tapes and through early internet file sharing. It became one of the first truly viral videos in history, years before YouTube even existed. Hollywood executives, comedy writers, and college students were all watching this crude little cartoon about Jesus beating the hell out of Santa Claus, and they could not stop talking about it. Parker and Stone used that momentum to pitch a television series to Comedy Central. The network said yes, and South Park premiered on August 13, 1997. The very first episode was called Cartman Gets an Anal Probe. Just from the title alone, you can tell exactly what kind of show this was going to be. The episode pulled a 1.3 Nielsen rating, which translated to roughly 980,000 viewers. For a small cable network like Comedy Central, that was enormous, but the audience grew fast. By the 10th episode of the first season, the ratings had skyrocketed to a 6.4 Nielsen. The show was becoming a cultural phenomenon at a speed that nobody had anticipated. and the impact on Comedy Central itself was staggering. Before South Park premiered, Comedy Central was available in approximately 9 million American households. Within a year of the show's debut, that number had exploded to around 50 million households. South Park did not just become a hit show, it single-handedly turned Comedy Central from a niche cable channel into a major player in the television industry. The show centered on 4 foul-mouthed elementary school boys living in the fictional small mountain town of South Park, Colorado. Stan Marsh, Kyle Broflovsky, Eric Cartman, and Kenny McCormick. Their everyday problems would escalate into absurd, satirical scenarios involving local residents, celebrities, politics, religion, and whatever else happened to be dominating the news cycle that week. The boys served as crude but oddly wise voices of reason against the irrational adults around them. And the show used profanity, violence, and relentless mockery of sacred cows on every side of the political and cultural spectrum to make its points. One of the things that made South Park completely unique among animated shows, and really among all television shows, was the production schedule. While most animated series take months to produce a single episode, South Park operated on a 6-day production cycle. Parker and Stone would conceive, write, voice, animate, and deliver a finished episode in roughly 6 days. This was unheard of in animation. The Simpsons, by comparison, takes about 6 to 8 months per episode. Family Guy operates on a similar timeline. South Park's insanely fast turnaround meant that the show could comment on events almost in real time. If something major happened in the news on a Monday, South Park could have an episode about it airing by the following Wednesday. This gave the show a relevance and a timeliness that no other animated series could match. It also meant that the show was constantly wading into whatever the hottest, most controversial topic of the moment happened to be. Because they could actually get to it while people still cared, and they went after everyone. That is the part that people sometimes forget when they talk about South Park's controversies. This was not a show that picked on one group while leaving others alone. Christianity was mocked relentlessly. Judaism was mocked. Mormonism got an entire episode devoted to tearing apart its beliefs. Hinduism, Buddhism, atheism, Scientology, celebrity culture, conservative politics, liberal politics, environmentalism, corporate greed, the military, the education system, the healthcare system. If you existed in American culture, South Park had something to say about you, and it was probably not very nice. The Parents Television Council, a conservative media watchdog group, placed South Park on their list of the worst primetime shows for family viewing in 2000, 2005, and 2006. The Federal Communications Commission received multiple formal complaints and petitions from viewers asking that the show be blocked from broadcasting entirely. None of it worked. The show kept airing, the audience kept growing, the controversies kept piling up. And Comedy Central kept cashing the checks because South Park was making them an enormous amount of money. The critical reception was strong too. The show won 5 Primetime Emmy Awards over the course of its run. It earned an overall score of 8.7 out of 10 on IMDb based on over 441,000 ratings. In 2009, it was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series, which was a historic moment because it was the first time an animated series had received that nomination since The Flintstones back in 1961. Not even The Simpsons, the most acclaimed animated comedy in television history, had ever received that particular honor. South Park did. But here's the thing about being an equal opportunity offender. It works perfectly as long as everybody you offend responds the same way. Christians complained, the show kept going. Scientologists complained, the show kept going. Mormons complained. Parker and Stone turned that into a Broadway musical called The Book of Mormon and won 9 Tony Awards. The formula was simple. Offend people, get complaints, keep going, make more money. It worked for every group South Park ever targeted, every single one. Until it didn't, because there was one group, one subject, one specific depiction that changed the rules entirely. And when South Park crossed that line, the consequences were not angry letters and boycott threats. The consequences were death threats, government censorship, and episodes erased from existence. To understand how that happened, we need to go back to 2001 to an episode that aired without a single complaint, without a single protest, without anyone caring at all. An episode that would not become controversial for another 9 years. an episode that nobody thought twice about until the world changed around it. On July 4th, 2001, Comedy Central aired the third episode of South Park's fifth season. It was called Super Best Friends. Trey Parker wrote it and directed it, same as he did with almost every episode of the show. The episode was nothing special by South Park standards at the time. It was funny, irreverent, ridiculous, and designed to poke fun at organized religion in the broadest possible way. It featured the kind of absurd premises and sharp satire that had become the show's trademark over its first 4 seasons. Nobody at Comedy Central flagged it as a potential problem. Nobody in the audience wrote angry letters about it. It was just another episode in a show that had already produced dozens of controversial episodes without any lasting consequences. The plot went like this. A street magician named David Blaine comes to the town of South Park and starts performing amazing feats that quickly draw a massive following. The boys all go to one of his camps, which turns out to be a front for a cult that Blaine has developed. The cult views Blaine as a messianic figure and calls all of his tricks miracles. Stan quickly realizes something is wrong and tries to leave, but Kyle has been fully drawn in and refuses to go with him. Kyle tells Stan that if he cannot accept this new religion, they are not friends anymore. Rejected and desperate, Stan goes to the one person in town he thinks might be able to help. Jesus Christ, who in the South Park universe is a regular character who lives in town and hosts a public access cable show. Jesus confronts Blaine at a big show in Denver, but his own miracles are pretty underwhelming compared to Blaine's flashy magic. The loaves and fishes thing does not exactly bring the house down when you are competing against a guy who can levitate. So Jesus calls in backup. He contacts the Super Best Friends, which is a parody of the old DC Comics Super Friends cartoon. The Super Best Friends are a team of major religious figures who have banded together to defend the world against evil. The team includes Jesus, Krishna, Joseph Smith, Lao Tse, Buddha, a character called Seaman, Moses, and Muhammad. Yes, that Muhammad. The Prophet Muhammad, founder of Islam, depicted as a member of a superhero team with the power of pyrokinesis, which means he could control and shoot fire from his hands. He also had the ability to fly. He appeared on screen fully visible, wearing yellow robes and an orange turban with thick eyebrows and dark facial hair. There was no censorship bar over him. There was no black box. There was no disclaimer. He was just there, fighting alongside Jesus and Buddha and the rest of the team, helping to save the world from a cult leader street magician. The Blaintologists, meanwhile, petition the government for tax-exempt status. When they are denied, Blaine orders all of his followers to commit mass suicide in Washington, D.C. Kyle, who is still trapped inside the cult, realizes the truth and tries to escape, but he is imprisoned in a glass bubble that begins filling with water. The Super Best Friends arrive to help. Blaine brings the statue of Abraham Lincoln to life to fight them, so the team creates a giant stone John Wilkes Booth which shoots the Lincoln statue in the head. Kyle is rescued, the cult collapses, and Stan delivers the moral of the episode to the crowd, announcing that any religion that forces you to give up your money or control of your life is really a cult. The Super Best Friends fly off into the sky, ready to return whenever the world needs them again. That was the episode. Muhammad was on screen, clearly depicted, clearly identified, fighting alongside the other religious figures as an equal member of the team. He had superpowers, he had speaking lines, he helped save the day. And when the episode aired on July 4th, 2001, absolutely nothing happened. There were no protests, there were no angry letters, there were no boycotts, there were no threats of any kind. The episode aired, it went into reruns, and it was rebroadcast multiple times over the following years without a single incident. This is important to understand because of what came later. The same depiction, the same image, the same character would eventually become the flashpoint for one of the most intense censorship battles in American television history. But in 2001, nobody cared. Muhammad had appeared in art and illustration throughout Islamic history in various cultural contexts. While many Islamic traditions discourage or prohibit visual depictions of the Prophet, this was not yet the kind of issue that would inspire violent international backlash. The world in 2001 was a different place. South Park was just doing what it always did, poking fun at religion across the board, and including Muhammad as one of many religious figures being satirized equally. He was not singled out. He was not disrespected any more or less than Jesus, who was depicted watching pornography in later episodes, or Buddha, who was shown snorting cocaine. The treatment was even-handed, and in 2001, that was enough. The episode went about its business, aired in syndication, showed up on DVD sets, and was available on the official South Park Studios website for years. It was a funny, clever early episode that fans enjoyed and then mostly forgot about. It would stay forgotten for nearly a decade. But the world was about to change in ways that would make Super Best Friends retroactively into one of the most controversial 22 minutes of animation ever produced. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this deep dive, subscribing really does help the channel grow. It is free and it means a lot. Now, back to the story. There is a 4-year gap between the Super Best Friends episode airing in 2001 and the next major chapter of this story beginning in 2005. And what happened in that gap changed everything. Not just for South Park, but for every media outlet, every newspaper, every television network, and every creative person in the Western world who had ever considered depicting the Prophet Muhammad in any form. On September 30th, 2005, a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten published 12 editorial cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. The newspaper commissioned the cartoons as a deliberate test of self-censorship after a Danish author named Kåre Bluitgen complained that he could not find anyone willing to illustrate a children's book about Muhammad because artists were too afraid of the potential consequences. The editor of Jyllands-Posten, Flemming Rose, invited cartoonists to draw Muhammad as they saw him, and 12 cartoonists responded with 12 different images. Some were straightforward portraits, others were satirical or provocative. One depicted Muhammad with a bomb in his turban. The newspaper published them on a full page, framing the exercise as a statement about the importance of free expression and the dangers of self-censorship in a democratic society. The reaction was unlike anything the modern Western media had ever experienced. It did not happen immediately. For months after the cartoons were published, the response was relatively contained. Danish Muslim organizations filed complaints. Some ambassadors from Muslim-majority countries requested meetings with the Danish government. But the larger global reaction was slow to build. Then, in early 2006, the cartoons were republished by newspapers in other European countries, and the situation exploded. There were massive protests across the Muslim world. Danish and Norwegian embassies were attacked and set on fire in Syria, Lebanon, and Iran. Boycotts of Danish products spread across the Middle East. Riots broke out in multiple countries. By the time the violence subsided, over 200 people had died in connection with protests and unrest linked to the cartoon controversy. 200 people dead because of 12 drawings in a newspaper. The scale of the backlash stunned the Western world. Media organizations that had initially considered republishing the cartoons in solidarity suddenly reversed course. Newspapers pulled planned reprints. Television networks issued internal guidelines prohibiting any visual depiction of Muhammad. Yale University Press, which was publishing a scholarly book about the controversy, made the decision to remove all images of the cartoons from the book itself, a book about the cartoons that did not contain the cartoons. Random House canceled the publication of a novel because it contained a fictionalized depiction of Muhammad. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York removed artworks depicting Muhammad from public display. A chilling effect settled over the entire Western media landscape. Before the Jyllands-Posten controversy, depicting Muhammad was uncommon but not unthinkable. Artists and cartoonists had done it throughout history without incident. After the controversy, it became understood as something potentially life-threatening, not just controversial, not just offensive, actually physically dangerous for the people involved. And this is where Trey Parker and Matt Stone enter the picture again. Parker was on his honeymoon at Disney World when the riots were dominating international news. He turned on the television in his hotel room and saw thousands of people protesting in the streets, and the news caption read something about Muslims being enraged over a cartoon. His immediate reaction, as he later described it, was to think that people had finally seen the Super Best Friends episode from 2001 and were angry about that. But no, it was the Danish cartoons. Nobody had paid any attention to South Park's depiction of Muhammad at all. It was still sitting there on the official website, available for anyone to watch, and nobody had said a word. Parker and Stone recognized instantly that they had their next target, not Muhammad himself, not Islam specifically. The target was the hypocrisy. The target was the idea that Western media organizations, which prided themselves on free speech and had no problem mocking Christianity, Judaism, Mormonism, and every other belief system on the planet, were suddenly drawing a line in the sand when it came to one specific religion. Not because they respected Islam more than other faiths, but because they were afraid. The media was treating Islam differently, not out of reverence, but out of fear. And Parker and Stone found that cowardice to be the perfect subject for satire. But when they went to Comedy Central with the idea of doing an episode about it, the network pushed back hard. Parker later described the conversations with the network as an ongoing battle. Comedy Central kept telling them that they were not going to broadcast a Muhammad episode. The creators of South Park, a show that had mocked every religion on Earth, were being told that there was one subject that was off limits. And the reason it was off limits was not because it was more offensive than anything else the show had done. It was because the people who might be offended by it had demonstrated a willingness to respond with violence. For Parker and Stone, this was not just a creative disagreement with their network. It was a fundamental free speech issue. If one group could use the threat of violence to silence criticism while every other group had to just deal with being mocked, then the entire principle of equal treatment in satire was dead. And that principle was the foundation of everything South Park stood for. The show had always operated on the belief that everyone gets made fun of equally. No sacred cows, no special treatment. The moment you carve out an exception for one group because you're afraid of them, you have admitted that fear works. And if fear works, then every group that wants to avoid being satirized just needs to be scary enough. That was the argument Parker and Stone were making, and they were about to make it on national television, whether Comedy Central liked it or not. What came next was a two-part episode that directly attacked the censorship itself, took aim at a rival television show in the process, and forced Comedy Central into a public confrontation with its own creators that would play out on screen for millions of viewers to see. But before we get there, if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel out enormously and allows us to keep creating content like this. Now let us talk about Cartoon Wars. On April 5th, 2006, Comedy Central aired the third episode of South Park's 10th season. It was called Cartoon Wars Part 1. 1 week later, on April 12th, the fourth episode aired, Cartoon Wars Part 2. Both were written and directed by Trey Parker, and together they represent one of the most audacious, confrontational, and meta things any animated show has ever done on television. These episodes did not just push boundaries, they went to war with their own network, attacked a rival show by name, and forced a real-time censorship battle that played out on screen in front of millions of viewers. Here is what happened. The story begins when the town of South Park learns that a fictional episode of Family Guy is about to air on the Fox network, and that this particular episode is going to depict the Prophet Muhammad. The townspeople panic. They are terrified that if Muhammad appears on their television screens, Muslim extremists will retaliate with violence. The entire town goes into crisis mode. People start burying their heads in the sand, literally, as a way to avoid being associated with whatever is about to happen. The mayor gives a speech. The government gets involved. Everyone is paralyzed by fear over the consequences of a cartoon showing a cartoon of Muhammad. Now, this is already a sharp piece of satire. Parker and Stone are mocking the exact panic and cowardice that they had witnessed in the real world after the Danish cartoons controversy. But the genius of the Cartoon Wars episodes is that they layered multiple targets on top of each other. The Muhammad censorship issue was the big one, but it was not the only thing they were going after. The subplot involves Eric Cartman, who is on a personal mission to get Family Guy canceled, but his reasons have nothing to do with Muhammad or religion or censorship. Cartman wants Family Guy off the air because people keep comparing his sense of humor to the show's comedy style, and he finds the comparison insulting. This is where the South Park creators got to do something they had clearly been wanting to do for a long time. They went after Family Guy directly. In Cartoon Wars Part 1, Cartman explains his hatred of Family Guy to Kyle. He tells Kyle that when he makes jokes, they are inherent to a story, deep, emotional jokes based on what is relevant and has a point. Unlike Family Guy, which he says just has one interchangeable joke after another. This is not just Cartman talking. This is Parker and Stone using Cartman as a mouthpiece to deliver their actual critique of Family Guy's writing style, which they had discussed publicly in interviews before. But that was just the setup. The real attack came in the depiction of how Family Guy's jokes are written. In the Cartoon Wars episodes, it is revealed that the writers of Family Guy are not actually human beings. The show's scripts are generated by a group of manatees in a tank who randomly push balls together. Each ball has a word or concept written on it, and whatever random combination the manatees push together becomes the next cutaway gag. A celebrity name, a random noun, and a weird situation get smashed together, and that becomes a Family Guy joke. The implication was savage. Parker and Stone were saying that Family Guy's humor was completely random, required no skill or thought, and could be generated by literal sea creatures bumping into objects by accident. Trey Parker and Matt Stone had been open about their feelings toward Family Guy before these episodes aired. They did not respect the show's writing. They felt that its cutaway-based comedy style was lazy and that it replaced actual storytelling with disconnected random jokes. The Cartoon Wars episodes were them putting those feelings on screen in the most public and confrontational way possible. And after those episodes aired, Parker and Stone reportedly received phone calls from writers on both The Simpsons and King of the Hill thanking them for making them. But the Family Guy subplot, as entertaining as it was, is not what got these episodes banned. What got them banned was the Muhammad storyline and what happened behind the scenes at Comedy Central. The plot builds toward a climactic moment. The fictional Family Guy episode is about to air. Kyle races to stop Cartman, who is trying to get the episode pulled. The argument between them is really the argument that was happening in the real world. Kyle represents the free speech position. He believes that if one group can use the threat of violence to censor content, then every group will try the same tactic and free expression will be destroyed. Cartman represents the position that some things are not worth the risk, although his real motivation is just personal spite. In Cartoon Wars Part 2, Cartman arrives at Fox Studios to convince the executives to pull the episode. While he is in the waiting room, he encounters a kid who looks like Bart Simpson. Cartman tries to convince Bart to let him handle the situation, and Bart eventually gives in after Cartman tells him about the time he tricked a kid into eating his own parents, which is a reference to the classic South Park episode Scott Tenorman Must Die. Meanwhile, Kyle is trying to fight his way through a world where everyone has buried their heads in the sand, literally refusing to watch or engage with the controversy. The episode builds to the moment everyone is waiting for. Is Family Guy going to show Muhammad? The audience is primed for the reveal, and then it happens. In the South Park episode, the fictional Family Guy episode airs, and Muhammad is shown. But here is where reality intersected with fiction in a way that stunned viewers. In the actual broadcast of Cartoon Wars Part 2 on Comedy Central, the moment where Muhammad was supposed to appear on screen was replaced by a black title card. The card read in plain white text that Comedy Central has refused to broadcast an image of Muhammad on their network. That was not a joke. That was not part of the script. That was the actual network, Comedy Central, stepping in and censoring the episode in real time. Parker and Stone had wanted to show Muhammad. They had written the episode with the intention of showing Muhammad, and Comedy Central overruled them and inserted a title card refusing to do it. The absurdity of the situation was staggering. In the very same episode where Comedy Central censored the image of Muhammad, the show included a fictional terrorist retaliation video that depicted Jesus defecating on President Bush and the American flag. That scene aired without any censorship at all. So the network was perfectly comfortable broadcasting a scene that was deeply offensive to Christians, but refused to show any image of the central figure of Islam. Not because they had more respect for Islam, but because they were afraid of the potential consequences. The hypocrisy was exactly the point that Parker and Stone were trying to make, and Comedy Central proved their argument for them by actually doing the thing they were satirizing. Parker later talked about the frustration of trying to get the network to understand what they were doing. He and Stone pointed out that they had already depicted Muhammad without controversy in Super Best Friends back in 2001. That episode had aired multiple times without a single complaint. The character had been on screen, fully visible, with superpowers and dialogue, and nobody said a word. But now, in 2006, after the Danish cartoons controversy had changed the global landscape, the same network that had aired Muhammad in 2001 was telling them they could never show him again. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on them. 5 years earlier, showing Muhammad was so unremarkable that it did not even register as a notable event. Now it was being treated as the single most dangerous thing their show could possibly do. Nothing about Muhammad had changed. Nothing about their show had changed. What had changed was the world's reaction to the topic, and that reaction was now dictating what a comedy show in America was allowed to put on screen. The critical response to Cartoon Wars was strong. Viewers understood what Parker and Stone were doing, and many praised the episodes for their willingness to tackle a subject that most of the entertainment industry was too scared to touch. But the episodes also drew significant controversy. The depiction of Muhammad, even the attempted depiction that was ultimately censored, attracted attention from groups who objected to any reference to the Prophet in a comedic context. Here is where it gets complicated in terms of what is actually banned. Cartoon Wars, Part 1 and Part 2 were not immediately pulled from circulation the way the later episodes would be. They continued to air in reruns for a time, and they were included in the DVD release of Season 10. But over the years, their availability has been steadily reduced. When HBO Max acquired the streaming rights to South Park in a massive deal worth $500 million, 5 episodes were excluded from the package. Cartoon Wars. Part 1 and Part 2 were 2 of them. They were also removed from the official South Park Studios website. As of right now, they cannot be legally streamed on any major platform. The episodes exist in a strange limbo. They were not banned all at once in a dramatic moment. They were slowly, quietly erased over time as the consequences of their content continued to ripple outward. What makes Cartoon Wars especially interesting in retrospect is how it set the stage for what was coming. Parker and Stone had made their argument about free speech and censorship as clearly as they possibly could. They had shown the hypocrisy of their own network. They had challenged the idea that fear should dictate what can and cannot be shown on television. And they had been overruled. The network had censored them. The image of Muhammad had been blocked. The free speech argument had lost. But Parker and Stone were not done. They were going to come back to this fight 4 years later in a pair of episodes that would push the confrontation further than anyone imagined. Episodes that would not just lead to censorship, but to actual death threats from an actual extremist organization, an FBI investigation, and the permanent erasure of 2 of the most ambitious episodes in the show's history. Before we get to that, though, there is another controversy we need to talk about. One that happened right around the same time as Cartoon Wars and involved not a banned episode, but a banned rebroadcast, a beloved voice actor, the Church of Scientology, and one of the strangest behind-the-scenes stories in the entire history of South Park. On November 16, 2005, Comedy Central aired the 12th episode of South Park's 9th season. It was called Trapped in the Closet. Trey Parker wrote and directed it, but in a rare move, he was credited under the pseudonym John Smith. That decision alone should tell you something about what was coming. The episode's plot is straightforward by South Park standards. Stan Marsh, curious about Scientology, walks into the local Scientology center and takes a personality test. His thetan levels, which in Scientology theology represent your spiritual essence, turn out to be extraordinarily high. So high, in fact, that the Scientologists declare Stan to be the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of the church. Stan is elevated to a position of near godhood within the organization, which brings Tom Cruise to his door. When Stan tells Cruise that he thinks his acting is okay but not as good as other people say, Cruise becomes devastated and locks himself in Stan's closet, refusing to come out. The rest of the episode is built around various characters trying to coax Tom Cruise out of the closet, which is of course a running joke about the persistent rumors regarding Cruise's sexuality. But the real centerpiece of the episode is not the Cruise closet joke. It is the scene where the show lays out the actual beliefs of Scientology in detail. The episode depicts the creation myth of Scientology, involving the galactic overlord Xenu, who 75 million years ago brought billions of people to Earth in spacecraft, stacked them around volcanoes, and blew them up with hydrogen bombs. The souls of those people, called Titans, are said to attach themselves to living humans and cause spiritual harm. While this story is being told on screen with full animation, a banner runs along the bottom of the screen that reads, in simple text, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." Parker and Stone were not exaggerating for comedic effect. They were presenting the actual theology, which to most outsiders reads like science fiction, and letting the inherent absurdity speak for itself. The episode ends with a running gag about everyone threatening to sue everyone else, a direct reference to Scientology's famously aggressive legal tactics. The final line of the episode has Stan challenging the church to go ahead and sue him, which was clearly Parker and Stone daring Scientology to take legal action against the show. Now, this episode was not technically banned. It aired. It is available on streaming platforms today. But what happened after it aired is one of the wildest behind-the-scenes stories in television, and it connects directly to the broader pattern of South Park episodes being censored or suppressed because of outside pressure. Isaac Hayes had been the voice of Chef on South Park since the very first season. Chef was the school cafeteria worker who served as a kind of mentor and moral compass for the boys. He was a beloved character, and Hayes, the legendary musician behind the Shaft theme song, brought warmth and charisma to the role that made Chef one of the most iconic characters on the show. Hayes had been with South Park for nearly a decade. He had recorded hundreds of lines of dialogue. He had appeared at conventions and in interviews, clearly enjoying the role and the connection it gave him to a new generation of fans. Hayes was also a practicing Scientologist, and when Trapped in the Closet aired, things got complicated. In the immediate aftermath of the episode's broadcast, Hayes appeared to take the parody in stride. In an interview with the AV Club in January 2006, roughly 2 months after the episode aired, Hayes laughed about it and acknowledged that he understood what Parker and Stone were doing. He seemed fine. He had been fine with the show mocking Christianity, Judaism, Mormonism, and every other religion for years. There was no indication that he was about to leave. Then everything changed. On March 13, 2006, a public statement was released in Hayes' name, announcing that he was leaving South Park. The statement said, and I am paraphrasing here, that there is a place in the world for satire, but there is a time when satire ends and intolerance and bigotry toward religious beliefs begins. The statement said that religious beliefs are sacred and should be respected and honored at all times. It did not use the word Scientology specifically, but the connection was obvious. Matt Stone responded immediately. He said that Hayes' departure was 100% about Scientology. Stone pointed out that in 10 years and over 150 episodes, Hayes had never had a problem with the show making fun of Christians, Muslims, Mormons, or Jews. The moment they satirized Scientology, suddenly Hayes discovered religious sensitivity. Stone called it out directly, saying that wanting a different standard for your own religion while being fine with mocking others is where intolerance and bigotry actually begin. But here is where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming until years later. Isaac Hayes may not have actually quit South Park at all. In January 2006, just 2 months before the resignation statement was released, Hayes suffered a stroke. The stroke was severe enough that he lost the ability to speak. He could barely communicate. He had to relearn how to play the piano. He was in no condition to be making career decisions, let alone writing eloquent public statements about religious intolerance. Hayes' son, Isaac Hayes III, first spoke about this publicly in a 2016 interview with The Hollywood Reporter. He said it plainly, Isaac Hayes did not quit South Park. Someone quit South Park for him. Hayes III explained that at the time of his father's stroke, everyone around him, his assistants, his publicists, his management, were all practicing Scientologists. These were the people making decisions on his behalf while he was incapacitated. And according to Hayes III, they are the ones who released the statement and pulled him from the show without his knowledge or consent. Matt Stone lent support to this version of events. In the same Hollywood Reporter piece, Stone said that they had sort of figured out the whole picture later and that it was totally what happened. Stone recalled a conversation with Hayes after the episode aired, where it was pretty obvious that someone had sent him to ask them to pull it. But the episode had already gone to air and they had not told Hayes about it in advance, specifically to give him plausible deniability. In 2025, Hayes III went further in an interview with Cracked. He stated that his father loved the show, loved Matt and Trey, and would have never quit voluntarily. He said that to this day, his father would still be on the show if the decision had been left to him. Hayes III also alleged that after the forced departure, Scientology associates pushed his father back into a touring schedule before he was physically ready, which he believes contributed to the decline in his health. Isaac Hayes passed away on August 10, 2008, at the age of 65. The Trapped in the Closet controversy also had consequences for the episode's broadcast history. A rebroadcast of the episode was scheduled for March 15, 2006, just 2 days after Hayes' resignation announcement. At the last minute, Comedy Central pulled it and replaced it with a different episode called Chef's Chocolate Salty Balls. The network claimed the swap was a tribute to Isaac Hayes following his departure. But reports from multiple entertainment outlets, including E! News and Fox News, attributed the cancellation to pressure from Tom Cruise. According to these reports, Cruise threatened to boycott the publicity tour for Mission Impossible 3, which was being distributed by Paramount Pictures, a company owned by Viacom, the same parent company that owned Comedy Central. If Cruise pulled out of his promotional obligations for a major summer blockbuster, Viacom stood to lose millions. Parker and Stone were reportedly told not to discuss the situation publicly to avoid embarrassing Cruise. Instead, they issued a statement through their lawyer that acknowledged the situation without directly addressing it. They signed the statement with the names Trey Parker and Matt Stone, servants of the Dark Lord Xenu. The LA Times dubbed the entire controversy Closetgate. The Trapped in the Closet episode eventually did return to the air and is currently available on streaming. It was not permanently banned, but the saga surrounding it reveals the kind of pressure that was being applied to South Park from multiple directions simultaneously. Scientology was pulling strings behind the scenes to silence the show's voice actors and suppress rebroadcasts. A major movie star was allegedly using his promotional leverage to get episodes pulled, and Comedy Central was caught in the middle, trying to balance its commitment to the show's creative freedom against the financial and legal pressure being applied by powerful people who did not want to be made fun of. And all of this was happening in the same period as the Cartoon Wars episodes and the Muhammad censorship battle. South Park in 2005 and 2006 was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, taking on Scientology, challenging Comedy Central's censorship of Muhammad, attacking Family Guy's writing style, and dealing with the loss of one of its most beloved cast members under deeply suspicious circumstances. But the biggest battle was still coming. 4 years later, Parker and Stone would return to the Muhammad issue one final time. And this time, the consequences would go far beyond network censorship and celebrity pressure. This time, there would be actual death threats from an actual extremist organization, an FBI response, and the permanent erasure of 2 episodes that represented everything South Park had always claimed to stand for. If you're enjoying this, please consider subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel and allows us to keep making these kinds of deep dives. Now let us talk about episodes 200 and 201, the episodes you still cannot watch. On April 14th, 2010, Comedy Central aired the 5th episode of South Park's 14th season. It was the show's 200th episode overall, so it was simply called 200. 1 week later, on April 21st, the 6th episode aired. It was called 201. Both were written and directed by Trey Parker. And these 2 episodes are, without exaggeration, the most controversial, the most censored, and the most permanently suppressed pieces of content in the entire history of South Park. They are the reason 3 other episodes were retroactively pulled from circulation. They are the reason the show is still banned in some countries to this day. And they represent the single moment where the real-world consequences of South Park's satire became genuinely dangerous for the people who made it. To celebrate the milestone of their 200th episode, Parker and Stone decided to do something special. They wanted to bring back as many past storylines, characters, and controversies as possible, creating a kind of greatest hits episode that rewarded longtime fans while also addressing the biggest ongoing controversy the show had ever faced. The result was an episode that was simultaneously a love letter to the show's history and a direct challenge to the forces that had been trying to censor it. Here's what happens in episode 200. It begins with the boys encountering Tom Cruise working at a fudge factory in South Park. Stan makes an innocent comment about Cruise being a fudge packer, meaning someone who literally packs fudge into boxes, which is what Cruise is doing. Cruise takes offense because of the phrase's other meaning and decides to file a class action lawsuit against the town of South Park. But he does not want to do it alone. He calls every single celebrity who has ever been mocked, insulted, or humiliated by the residents of South Park, and he gathers them together to join the lawsuit. This is the episode's excuse to bring back dozens of celebrities who had appeared in previous episodes, from Rob Reiner to Mel Gibson to Paris Hilton to Barbra Streisand. The celebrities' lawsuit threatens to bankrupt and shut down the entire town. But Cruz offers a way out. He says he will drop the lawsuit under one condition. The town has to bring him Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad. Cruz wants to meet him in person. Why? Because Cruz has figured out that Muhammad possesses a special power. In the world of the show, Muhammad cannot be ridiculed. He is the one figure who is completely immune to mockery and satire. Cruz wants to steal that power. He and his ally Rob Reiner explain that every person has a kind of essence inside them, which they call goo, and that this essence can be transferred from one being to another. Cruz's plan is to extract Muhammad's go and use it to make himself permanently immune to ridicule. He pitches this idea to the other celebrities by asking them how they would feel if nobody could ever make fun of them again. Stan points out that he actually met Muhammad once before back in the Super Best Friends episode, and that at the time nobody cared, but the world has changed. The boys go to the hall of the Super Best Friends to ask if Muhammad can come to South Park. The Super Best Friends refuse. They say they cannot allow Muhammad to appear in public because of the risk of terrorist attacks. Stan and Kyle suggest disguises, but every idea is shot down because no part of Muhammad can be visible. Eventually, the Super Best Friends agree to let Muhammad travel to South Park in a U-Haul truck, where he can be heard but not seen. Meanwhile, there is a parallel storyline involving Eric Cartman. At the beginning of the episode, Cartman is on a separate mission that seems unrelated to the Muhammad plot. He is trying to discover the true identity of his father, a mystery that had been set up in the Season 1 finale and the Season 2 premiere and then left unresolved for over a decade. Cartman's quest brings him into contact with Mr. Garrison and Mr. Hat, Dr. Mephisto, and eventually Scott Tenorman, the kid from Season 5's Scott Tenorman Must Die, who Cartman had tricked into eating his own parents. The Muhammad plot reaches a critical point when the citizens of South Park try to hand Muhammad over to the celebrities. But there is a problem. The celebrities want Muhammad to come out of the truck. The town cannot let him be seen. Their solution is to put Muhammad inside a full Body Bear mascot costume that covers him from head to toe. The exchange is about to happen when a new complication arises. A group of gingers, red-headed people, demand to see Muhammad as well. They threaten to blow up the town if Muhammad is not revealed to them. The episode ends on a massive cliffhanger. The gingers are about to detonate explosives. Mecha Streisand, a giant robotic version of Barbara Streisand from one of the show's earliest episodes, has been activated and is preparing to attack. The citizens are trying to figure out how to satisfy everyone's demands without allowing Muhammad to be seen. And Mr. Hat is about to reveal the true identity of Cartman's father. To be continued. That was 200. It aired, it generated headlines, and it set the stage for the most explosive week in the show's history. Within a week of the episode airing, a New York-based organization called Revolution Muslim posted an entry on their website that sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. The post warned that Trey Parker and Matt Stone would probably wind up like Theo Van Gogh for airing this episode. Theo Van Gogh was a Dutch filmmaker who had been murdered in Amsterdam on November 2, 2004. He was shot 8 times on a public street and then stabbed with 2 knives, one of which pinned a 5-page note to his chest threatening others who criticized Islam. Van Gogh had directed a short film called Submission that dealt with the abuse of women in Islamic societies. He was killed for it. By invoking Van Gogh's name, Revolution Muslim was making an implicit but unmistakable threat. Do what he did, and what happened to him will happen to you. The Revolution Muslim post did not stop there. It included audio clips of a sermon by Anwar al-Awlaki, an al-Qaeda imam who explicitly called for the assassination of anyone who defamed Muhammad. The sermon stated that harming Allah and his messenger is a reason to encourage Muslims to kill whoever does that. The post also included a link to a 2009 Huffington Post article that contained details about the location of Parker and Stone's home in Colorado. And it included images of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a well-known activist and critic of Islam who lives under permanent security protection because of similar threats against her life. The author of the Revolution Muslim post was a man named Zachary Adam Chesser. He later said the post was meant as a warning, not a threat, and that providing the addresses was meant to give people the opportunity to protest. Law enforcement officials did not see it that way. The New York City Police Department immediately increased security at the Comedy Central headquarters in Manhattan. The FBI began monitoring the situation. While law enforcement assessed Revolution Muslim itself as being all talk, meaning they had never engaged in actual violence, they were concerned that the website post could inspire violence from others. A small fringe group putting detailed personal information about someone online alongside audio calls for assassination was not something the authorities could ignore, regardless of the group's own track record. Zachary Adam Chesser was subsequently arrested and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Not specifically for the South Park threat, but for multiple offenses, including providing material support to a terrorist organization. The threat against Parker and Stone was part of the broader case against him. Now let us talk about what happened when episode 201 actually aired. The story picks up right where 200 left off. The Gingers unzip the bear costume, expecting to find Muhammad inside, but it turns out to be Santa Claus. Stan explains that they made a promise to Jesus that Muhammad would stay in the U-Haul. But before anyone can sort out the situation, Micah Streisand activates and begins rampaging through South Park, destroying buildings and killing characters left and right. Pip, a minor character who had been on the show since the early seasons, is squashed and killed while trying to reason with her. The Super Best Friends arrive to help, riding on what the episode calls Super Best Friends power cycles, which are basically segways. Meanwhile, Buddha is snorting cocaine and Jesus is watching pornography. These are the same religious figures being depicted alongside Muhammad. The same episode, the same scene. Jesus and Buddha are shown doing explicitly offensive things, and those images aired without any censorship at all. The celebrities get their hands on Muhammad and use Cruise's machine to extract his goo, which gives them the power to never be ridiculed again. Tom Cruise literally becomes immune to mockery. The Gingers then surround the town and demand Muhammad as well. The Cartman subplot reaches its conclusion when Scott Tenorman returns and forces the townspeople to reveal the truth about Cartman's father. The truth is that Cartman's father was one of the Denver Broncos, which had been the answer teased all the way back in season 2, but never fully confirmed. The episode builds to a final scene where the main characters deliver a speech about the lesson they have learned. And this is where the most significant act of censorship in the show's history occurs. The speech, which was about the importance of standing up to intimidation and not allowing fear to dictate what can and cannot be said, was completely and totally bleeped out by Comedy Central. Not partially bleeped, not selectively edited, not trimmed for time or toned down for sensitivity. Every single word of the ending speech was replaced with a continuous audio bleep that lasted for the entire duration of the scene. The audience heard nothing. The message of the episode, the entire point of what Parker and Stone were trying to say, the culmination of a two-part story that had been building toward this exact moment, was erased, silenced, replaced by a flat, monotonous tone that communicated nothing except the fact that something was being hidden from you. But it was not just the speech. Comedy Central went further than they had with Cartoon Wars. Every single mention of Muhammad's name throughout the entire episode was bleeped, not just the visual depiction, the word itself, his name. You could not see Muhammad and you could not hear anyone say his name. He was censored out of existence at both the visual and audio levels. Parker and Stone issued a statement through their website, South Park Studios. They said that Comedy Central's decision to censor the episode went beyond what they had agreed to. They made it clear that the heavy censorship of the final speech was the network's decision, not theirs. The speech was not intended to be bleeped. It was meant to be heard. Comedy Central had silenced the very message about free speech that the episode was built to deliver. The irony could not have been more bitter. The public response was intense. A poll conducted by Zogby International found that 71% of Americans disagreed with Comedy Central's decision to censor the episode. Only 19% supported it. 47% of those who disagreed said they felt strongly about it, while only 5% of those who agreed claimed to feel strongly. The American public overwhelmingly sided with Parker and Stone over the network. Jon Stewart, the host of The Daily Show, which aired on the same network as South Park, devoted a full 10-minute segment to the controversy. He expressed disgust toward Revolution Muslim and their threats. He acknowledged that Comedy Central had likely censored the episode to protect their employees from potential harm, but he made it clear that he found the entire situation deeply troubling. He ended his segment with a song directed at Revolution Muslim that was not exactly family-friendly. Bill Maher, the host of HBO's Real Time, used the situation to talk about the importance of the First Amendment. He said that the threats against South Park served as a reminder that American civil liberties are fundamentally different from those in cultures where death threats against cartoonists are considered acceptable. The controversy also inspired what became known as Everybody Draw Muhammad Day, a grassroots movement where people around the world drew and posted images of Muhammad as a protest against censorship and in support of Parker and Stone's right to depict whatever they wanted. The movement was partially a direct response to the events surrounding episodes 200 and 201, but perhaps the most significant consequence of all was what happened to the episodes themselves. Both 200 and 201 were pulled from circulation. They were removed from Comedy Central's rerun schedule. They were taken down from the official South Park Studios website. They were excluded from the HBO Max streaming bundle when the $500 million deal was signed. They are not available on Paramount+. They are not available on any legal streaming service anywhere in the world. The versions that exist on the Season 14 DVD and Blu-ray release are the censored versions. Muhammad's name is bleeped throughout. His image is covered by a black censored bar. The final speech remains completely muted. Even on physical media that you can purchase and hold in your hands, the content has been altered. And in certain international territories, the situation is even worse. In the United Kingdom, both episodes have been omitted entirely from DVD releases. The Region 4 release, which covers Australia and other territories, also has omissions. These are the most thoroughly banned, most completely suppressed episodes in the entire history of South Park. A show that has been on the air for nearly 30 years, that has produced over 300 episodes, that has taken on every powerful institution in America, was permanently silenced on this one specific subject. The episodes about Muhammad cannot be watched. The message about free speech cannot be heard. The point the creators were trying to make about fear and intimidation was proven correct by the very act of silencing it. And as a direct result of the 200 and 201 controversy, the Super Best Friends episode from 2001 was retroactively pulled from all platforms as well. The episode that had aired 9 years earlier without a single complaint was suddenly deemed too dangerous to exist. It was removed from streaming, removed from the website, and removed from syndication. Not because anything about the episode itself had changed, but because the world around it had changed enough to make its mere existence a perceived risk. 5 episodes total: Super Best Friends, Cartoon Wars Part 1, Cartoon Wars Part 2, 200, 201, all pulled from legal availability because of the depiction or discussion of the Prophet Muhammad, all absent from every major streaming platform, all effectively erased from the show's accessible catalog. The man who created those episodes, Trey Parker, was on the picket line during both the 2007 to 2008 and 2023 Writers Guild strikes, fighting for the rights of creative people to have control over their own work. He spent decades arguing that comedy should have no sacred cows and no off-limits subjects, and his own network proved him right by creating exactly the kind of exception he was arguing against. One subject, one figure, one religion that received special treatment because the consequences of offending it were uniquely dangerous. Whether you agree with Parker and Stone or you think they went too far, the facts of what happened are not in dispute. They tried to depict Muhammad, they were censored. They tried to talk about being censored, they were censored again. The speech about censorship was itself censored. And the episodes were permanently removed so that no one could ever see or hear what they had tried to say. Before we move on, if you are finding this interesting, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel out enormously, and we really appreciate every single person who does. Now let us move on to the other South Park controversies that generated bans and censorship, because the Muhammad episodes were not the only time the show ran into trouble with the real world. On December 7th, 2005, Comedy Central aired the 14th and final episode of South Park's 9th season. It was called Bloody Mary, and while this episode was never permanently banned from streaming the way the Muhammad episodes were, it generated one of the most organized and sustained protest campaigns in the show's history, and it was pulled from broadcast in certain countries entirely. The episode's plot centers on Randy Marsh, Stan's father, who gets a DUI after drinking too much and driving home from a party. Randy is ordered by the court to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, where he quickly becomes convinced that he is a helpless alcoholic who has a disease and cannot control his own behavior. He starts using his supposed alcoholism as an excuse for everything, refusing to take personal responsibility because, as the AA philosophy teaches, alcoholism is a disease and the addict is powerless against it. Meanwhile, a statue of the Virgin Mary at a local Catholic church appears to be bleeding. Worshippers flock to the statue, believing it is a miracle. People with all kinds of ailments line up to be blessed by the bleeding statue, hoping for cures. The Catholic Church sends investigators, and eventually Pope Benedict XVI himself travels to South Park to examine the statue. After inspecting it, the Pope declares that the statue is not performing a miracle. Why? Because the blood is coming from the statue's rear end, and the Pope determines that the statue is actually menstruating. Since women menstruate all the time, the Pope says, this is not a miracle at all. It is just a natural bodily function. Before the Pope's declaration, Randy had visited the statue and been sprayed with blood, which he believed cured his alcoholism. After the Pope announces that the bleeding is not miraculous, Randy realizes that the cure was never real and that he has to actually take responsibility for his own drinking. Stan tells his father that if he can manage to control his drinking most of the time, then he does not have a disease. He just has a problem. The episode ends with Randy accepting that he needs to take personal responsibility rather than hiding behind the label of alcoholism. The religious elements of this episode, specifically the depiction of the Virgin Mary bleeding from her rear end and the Pope being sprayed with blood, caused an enormous backlash from Catholic organizations. The Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights, led by its president William Donahue, launched a major campaign against the episode. Donahue called the episode an assault on Catholics and demanded that Comedy Central pull it permanently. He organized boycotts and pressured advertisers to withdraw their support from the show. In New Zealand, the campaign was partially successful. The Catholic Bishops' Conference of New Zealand lobbied the country's Broadcasting Standards Authority, and the episode was pulled from broadcast there. In several other international markets, local broadcasters made the decision not to air the episode based on the intensity of the Catholic backlash. In the United States, however, Comedy Central held firm. The episode was not pulled from the American broadcast schedule. It continued to air in reruns and was included on the Season 9 DVD release. It is currently available on streaming platforms. The Catholic League's campaign generated significant media coverage and public debate, but it did not result in permanent suppression of the episode. What makes Bloody Mary interesting in the context of this video is the contrast. When Catholic organizations protested, the episode stayed on the air. When Scientology applied pressure over Trapped in the Closet, the rebroadcast was pulled temporarily, but the episode eventually returned and is now available. When Muslim extremists issued death threats over the Muhammad episodes, those episodes were permanently erased. The pattern is hard to miss. The level of suppression directly correlated with the severity of the threat. Angry letters and boycott campaigns resulted in temporary disruptions at most. Death threats and the invocation of real-world violence resulted in permanent censorship. Parker and Stone noticed this pattern too, and it was a major part of what motivated them to keep pushing on the Muhammad issue. They saw the inconsistency. They saw that the rules of engagement were different depending on who was doing the complaining. And they believed that allowing that inconsistency to stand was fundamentally corrosive to the principle of free expression. If the only way to get permanent protection from satire was to be the scariest group in the room, then the message being sent to everyone was that violence works and peaceful protest does not. Now let us jump forward 13 years from the religious controversies of the mid-2000s to a very different kind of ban. One that had nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with death threats, and everything to do with the power of a government that decided it did not like being made fun of. On October 2nd, 2019, Comedy Central aired the second episode of South Park's 23rd season. It was called Banned in China. And within days of airing, the entire South Park franchise, not just this one episode, but every episode, every clip, every discussion, every mention of the show, was scrubbed from the Chinese internet. This was not a targeted response to one piece of content. This was the nuclear option. A government with control over the internet access of over 1 billion people decided that an animated comedy show from Colorado had crossed a line, and their response was to make that show disappear entirely from the digital landscape of the most populated country on Earth. No negotiation, no warning, no gradual escalation, just total, complete, immediate erasure. The episode's plot runs on two parallel storylines. In the first, Stan Marsh is frustrated with his family's move to Tegrity Farms, the marijuana farm that his father Randy had started in the previous season. Stan starts a death metal band called Crimson Dawn as a way to work through his anger. The band catches the attention of a Hollywood producer who wants to make a biographical film about them. But as they start developing the biopic, the studio informs them that certain elements of their story will have to be removed or changed in order to make the film marketable in China. References to drugs, to politically sensitive topics, to anything that might offend the Chinese government have to go. The creative integrity of their own story is being gutted to satisfy a foreign government's censorship rules. In the second storyline, Randy travels to China to try to expand the Tegrity Farms marijuana business into the Chinese market. He is arrested and sent to a labor camp. And this is where the episode takes its most pointed swing at the Chinese government. Inside the labor camp, Randy meets fellow prisoners Winnie the Pooh and Piglet. In the real world, images of Winnie the Pooh had been banned in China because internet users had created memes comparing Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping to the cartoon bear. The comparison was based on perceived physical resemblances in photographs that had gone viral. The Chinese government responded by blocking images and mentions of Winnie the Pooh from Chinese social media platforms. Parker and Stone took that real-world absurdity and turned it into a plot point. In the episode, Pooh and Piglet are literally imprisoned in a Chinese labor camp because the government found the comparison offensive. Randy is brought before a Chinese court and criticizes the government for how it treats its prisoners, accusing them of lacking integrity, his recurring mispronunciation of integrity. The episode weaves both storylines together to make a larger point about how the American entertainment industry compromises its own creative freedom to gain access to the Chinese market. Hollywood studios routinely cut scenes, remove characters, alter storylines, and self-censor their products to avoid angering Chinese censors because the Chinese box office is worth billions of dollars annually, and losing access to it means losing a massive revenue stream. The episode argues that this self-censorship amounts to American companies voluntarily surrendering their creative independence to a foreign authoritarian government in exchange for money. The Chinese government's response was swift and total. Within days of the episode airing, every trace of South Park was erased from Chinese internet platforms. The streaming service Youku, where episodes had previously been available, removed all South Park content. The social media platform Weibo, which is China's equivalent of Twitter, showed zero results for any South Park-related search. Discussions about the show on Baidu, China's largest search engine, were deleted. Content was scrubbed from Douban, a popular review platform. Zhihu, an equivalent of Quora, had its South Park threads removed. Even Bilibili, a video-sharing platform popular with young Chinese users, purged all South Park-related content. A South Park discussion thread on Tieba, a forum platform, displayed a message that read, "According to the relevant law and regulation, this section is temporarily not open. This was not a partial ban. This was not a warning. This was a total erasure of the entire franchise from the Chinese internet. Not just the Banned in China episode. Every episode of every season of the entire show. Every clip, every fan discussion, every review. Gone." Parker and Stone responded with what became one of the most talked about public statements in the history of the show. On October 7th, 2019, they posted a message on the official South Park Twitter account titled, "Official Apology to China." The statement read, and I am going to share the whole thing because it is worth hearing in full. It said, "Like the NBA, we welcome the Chinese censors into our homes and into our hearts. We too love money more than freedom and democracy. She doesn't look just like Winnie the Pooh at all. Tune in to our 300th episode this Wednesday at 10. Long live the great Communist Party of China. May this autumn's sorghum harvest be bountiful. We good now, China?" The reference to the NBA was pointed and timely. Just days before the South Park ban, the general manager of the Houston Rockets basketball team, Daryl Morey, had posted a tweet supporting the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. China reacted furiously. Chinese broadcasters announced they would stop airing Rockets games. Local sponsors pulled their funding. The NBA, fearing the loss of the massive Chinese market, scrambled to distance itself from Morey's comments and issued a statement, acknowledging that the tweet may have deeply offended friends and fans in China. The league's response was widely criticized in America as kowtowing to an authoritarian government at the expense of free speech. Parker and Stone's mock apology was a direct jab at the NBA's response. By sarcastically saying that they too love money more than freedom and democracy, they were calling out every American company and institution that had compromised its values to maintain access to Chinese revenue. And unlike the NBA, Parker and Stone did not actually apologize. They doubled down. Their follow-up episode, the 300th episode of the series, continued the China storyline. The Banned in China episode remains available on Western streaming platforms. It was never pulled from Comedy Central, Paramount Plus, or any domestic distribution channel. The ban exists only within China's borders, but within those borders it is absolute. The entire South Park franchise remains inaccessible to Chinese internet users to this day. And Parker and Stone have shown zero interest in walking back their criticism or making amends with the Chinese government in order to regain access to that market. What makes the China ban different from the Muhammad bans is instructive. The Muhammad episodes were pulled by the show's own network. Comedy Central made the decision to censor and suppress those episodes because of safety concerns related to violent threats. The China ban was imposed by a foreign government as an act of state censorship, and the show's creators and its network both stood behind the content. The difference in response tells you something about the dynamics at play. When the threat comes from a non-state actor making death threats, the tendency is to capitulate. When the threat comes from a government cutting off market access, it is easier to stand firm because no one's physical safety is at risk. The lost revenue from China is a financial inconvenience. The death threats from extremist organizations were a matter of life and death. And that distinction is exactly why the Muhammad episodes remain banned, while Banned in China does not. Before we keep going, if you are enjoying this video, please consider subscribing. It is completely free, and it helps us keep making content like this. We are almost at the end of the story, but there are a few more pieces of the puzzle that complete the full picture of South Park's complicated relationship with censorship around the world. The Muhammad episodes and the China ban are the headline stories. They are the ones that generate the most discussion, the most analysis, and the most debate. But they are not the only examples of South Park running into walls around the world. The show has been banned, censored, protested, or suppressed in multiple countries across multiple continents. And each case tells its own story about the limits of satire and the different ways that governments and cultures respond to content they find objectionable. Let us start with India. In 2010, the Indian Ministry of Broadcasting banned South Park outright. The show was deemed too vulgar for Indian audiences, and its content was considered offensive to religious sentiments, which is a particularly sensitive legal category in India, where blasphemy and religious insult laws carry real weight. The ban meant that South Park could not be broadcast on Indian television, could not be legally distributed in the country, and could not be accessed through official streaming channels within India's borders. The show simply did not exist in India for nearly a decade. That changed in 2019 when Netflix India acquired streaming rights to the series. The show was made available on the platform with an 18+ rating, meaning it was restricted to adult users only. This was a significant moment because it represented the first time South Park had been legally accessible in India in almost 10 years. The fact that it took a global streaming platform with enough leverage to negotiate directly with content regulators to break through the ban tells you how firmly the Indian government had closed the door on the show. The restoration of access did not mean that the controversy was over, though. Many Indian viewers and commentators continued to find the show's content objectionable, and the 18+ rating served as an acknowledgement that the material was considered extreme even by the standards of a country that produces its own share of provocative entertainment. The India ban was not specifically about the Muhammad episodes or any single piece of content. It was about the show as a whole. The Indian government's position was that the show's overall level of profanity, sexual content, and irreverent treatment of religion made it unsuitable for broadcast in the country. This is a fundamentally different kind of ban from what happened in China or with the Muhammad episodes. In those cases, specific content triggered specific responses. In India, it was the show's entire identity that was deemed unacceptable. The show was not punished for one thing it said. It was punished for being the kind of show that says those kinds of things. Then there is Sri Lanka. When episodes 200 and 201 aired in 2010 and generated their massive international controversy, the fallout was not limited to the United States and the Muslim world. Sri Lanka banned South Park in response to those episodes, but the reasoning was different from what you might expect. The Sri Lankan ban was not primarily about the depiction of Muhammad, it was about the depiction of Buddha. In episodes 200 and 201, Buddha is shown snorting cocaine. Sri Lanka is a predominantly Buddhist country, and the depiction of the religion's central figure engaging in drug use was considered deeply offensive. The show was pulled from broadcast in Sri Lanka, and it has remained banned there. This is a detail that gets overlooked in most discussions about the banned episodes because the Muhammad controversy dominated the conversation so completely. But the fact that a Buddhist country banned the show for the depiction of Buddha, not Muhammad, demonstrates that the 200 and 201 controversy was not a single-issue event. It was a multi-directional explosion that offended different people in different countries for different reasons, all stemming from the same pair of episodes. This adds another layer to the complexity of the 200 and 201 situation. Parker and Stone's argument had always been about equal treatment. They showed Jesus watching pornography, Buddha snorting cocaine, and Muhammad hidden behind a censored bar, all in the same episode. Their point was that if you're going to satirize religion, you should satirize all religions equally, without special treatment for any of them. But the real-world consequences of that approach were not equal at all. The depiction of Jesus generated complaints but no ban. The depiction of Muhammad generated death threats and permanent episode suppression. And the depiction of Buddha generated a national ban in Sri Lanka. The same episode produced 3 completely different levels of consequence depending on which religious figure was being discussed and which country was doing the watching. The show also ran into trouble in other parts of the world for various reasons. In Australia, the episode Hell on Earth 2006, which was a Halloween special, generated complaints for its content. But the more significant Australian censorship story involves the South Park video game rather than the show itself. South Park, The Stick of Truth, a role-playing game released in 2014, was initially banned in Australia by the country's classification board. The game included interactive sequences involving alien anal probing and an abortion minigame, both of which were deemed to exceed the allowable content limits under Australian classification law. A censored version of the game was eventually released for the Australian market, with the offending sequences replaced by screens describing what was happening in text form rather than showing it interactively. Similar censorship was applied in European and Israeli markets. The Stick of Truth ban is worth mentioning because it demonstrates that the censorship of South Park content extends beyond the television show itself. The franchise as a whole, including its games, its film, and its various media properties, has repeatedly run into regulatory and cultural barriers around the world. The South Park theatrical film, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, which was released in 1999, was itself the subject of significant controversy. It was rated R in the United States, and the MPAA initially wanted to give it an NC-17 rating, which would have effectively killed its theatrical distribution. Parker and Stone had to make multiple rounds of cuts and edits to bring the film down to an R rating, and the final product was still considered extremely controversial upon release. Now, stepping back from the specific countries and controversies for a moment, there is a broader pattern here that is worth examining. South Park has been on the air since 1997. That is nearly 3 decades of continuous production. Over that time, the show has generated hundreds of controversies, received thousands of complaints, and been the subject of countless protest campaigns. The Parents Television Council went after it. The Catholic League went after it. Scientology went after it. The Chinese government went after it. Muslim extremists went after it. Hindu groups in certain countries have raised objections. Animal rights organizations have complained about specific episodes. Advocacy groups for people with disabilities have criticized certain depictions. Politicians on both sides of the aisle have called for the show to be canceled. And through all of that, the show has survived. It has not just survived, it has thrived. In July of 2025, Parker and Stone signed a $1.5 billion extension deal with Paramount Global that guarantees 50 new episodes, roughly 10 per year, and extends the show through at least the 2029 to 2030 television season. That is a staggering amount of money for any television property, and it speaks to the enduring value that the South Park brand carries even after nearly 30 years on the air. The show's most recent seasons have continued to generate significant viewership. Season 27, which premiered on July 23, 2025, pulled in 5.9 million cross-platform viewers within 3 days of its premiere. That represented a 68% increase over the Season 26 premiere. It was the biggest Comedy Central premiere share since 1999, which was the show's original heyday. The second episode of Season 27 drew approximately 6.2 million cross-platform viewers in its first 3 days, making it the most watched South Park episode since 2018. These are not the numbers of a show in decline. These are the numbers of a show that, despite everything, despite the bans, the censorship, the death threats, the government scrubs, the loss of beloved cast members, and the constant pressure from every direction, continues to command an enormous audience. People are still watching, people are still caring, and Parker and Stone are still making new episodes with the same 6-day production cycle that has defined the show since the beginning. The production method itself is part of what keeps the show relevant and worth talking about. Because South Park episodes are produced in roughly 6 days from concept to broadcast, the show maintains a timeliness that no other animated series can match. When something happens in the news, South Park can have an episode about it airing within a week. This means the show is always current, always relevant, and always engaged with whatever the biggest cultural conversation of the moment happens to be. There is a documentary called 6 Days to Air that followed the production of the Season 15 premiere and showed exactly how this process works. Parker barely sleeps during production weeks. The writing, voice recording, and animation all happen simultaneously. Deadlines are measured in hours, not weeks. It is a relentless, exhausting process that would break most creative teams, but Parker and Stone have maintained it for decades. This 6-day cycle is also part of why the show has maintained its edge for so long. Most animated comedies lose their relevance over time because by the time an episode airs, the cultural moment it was responding to has already passed. South Park does not have that problem. The show can react to something that happened last Tuesday and have a fully produced, fully animated response on the air the following Wednesday. This gives the show a sense of immediacy that keeps audiences coming back because they know that whatever is happening in the world, South Park is going to have something to say about it, and they are going to say it fast. The financial model of the show also plays a role in its survival. Animated shows are significantly cheaper to produce than live-action programming. There are no expensive sets to build, no large on-screen casts to pay, no location shoots to coordinate. The voice recording happens in a booth. The animation, while increasingly sophisticated compared to the construction paper cutouts of the early days, is still produced efficiently using proprietary software that Parker and Stone developed specifically for the show's fast turnaround schedule. The entire operation is lean and efficient, which means the show does not need massive ratings to justify its existence. It needs to be profitable, and given its low production costs, relatively modest viewership numbers are more than enough to keep the lights on. On top of the broadcast revenue, South Park generates enormous value in secondary markets. The show airs in reruns on Adult Swim, Comedy Central, FXX, and other cable networks. It streams on Paramount+. It generates merchandise revenue from t-shirts, toys, video games, and other products. The South Park video games alone have been major commercial successes. The Stick of Truth sold millions of copies, and its sequel, The Fractured But Whole, was similarly successful. The Broadway musical, The Book of Mormon, while not technically a South Park product, was created by Parker and Stone and showcases the same comedic sensibility. It has grossed hundreds of millions of dollars in ticket sales since its premiere in 2011. All of this means that South Park exists within a financial ecosystem that makes it virtually cancellation-proof. Even if the broadcast ratings were to drop significantly, the show's value in reruns, streaming, merchandising, and brand recognition would likely keep it going. This is both a strength and a source of criticism. Some fans argue that the show has been going on for too long, that the quality has declined in recent years, and that Parker and Stone should have ended it while it was still at its peak. Others point to episodes like the Season 27 premiere, which drew massive numbers and generated cultural conversation on a scale that most new shows would envy, as evidence that the show still has gas in the tank. Season 27, for example, centered on a highly serialized narrative involving a caricature of Donald Trump during his second administration, depicting an abusive romantic relationship between Trump and Satan. It included parodies of Kristi Noem and J.D. Vance, explored surveillance themes, and generated a viral meme around the number sequence 67. Season 28, which aired later in 2025, took on an internet meme obsession among the boys. A Peter Thiel character investigating the meme as a potential Antichrist cult, and a storyline where Trump and J.D. Vance conspire to secretly abort Satan's baby. It even had PC Principal physically fighting Jesus Christ over modern Christianity. The show has not slowed down. If anything, it has gotten more ambitious and more willing to take on subjects that other shows would consider too risky. The 6-day production cycle means that the show can respond to the Trump administration's latest actions within a week, making it one of the only pieces of scripted television that can function as near real-time political commentary. This is what makes the banned episodes so notable in context. South Park has produced over 330 episodes. It has attacked virtually every powerful institution in American society. It has generated enough controversy to fill a small library, and yet only 5 episodes have been permanently pulled from streaming, with one additional episode triggering a nationwide ban in China. 5 out of 338, less than 2% of the show's total output. The threshold for actually getting a South Park episode banned is extraordinarily high. Complaints do not do it. Boycotts do not do it. Even organized campaigns from well-funded advocacy groups do not do it. The only things that have successfully gotten South Park episodes permanently removed from circulation are credible threats of physical violence and the assertion of state power by an authoritarian government. And even the China ban did not result in the episode being suppressed in the West. Banned in China is freely available on every major streaming platform outside of China. The only content that has been genuinely erased from the show's accessible catalog are the 5 Muhammad episodes, because the nature of the threat against them was uniquely personal and uniquely dangerous. Let us also take a moment to talk about one more controversy that, while it did not result in a formal ban, is worth including in this story because it illustrates the range of reactions that South Park has provoked over the years. In Season 10, the very first episode was called The Return of Chef. This episode was created directly in response to Isaac Hayes' departure from the show. Rather than simply writing Chef out quietly, Parker and Stone created an episode where Chef returns to South Park after being brainwashed by a group called the Super Adventure Club, which is a thinly veiled parody of Scientology. Chef's dialogue in the episode was assembled by splicing together lines from previous episodes, creating a disjointed and unsettling effect. The episode ends with Chef being killed in an extremely graphic manner, falling off a bridge, being impaled, mauled by animals, and set on fire, before his body is reanimated by the Super Adventure Club. It was brutal, it was over the top, and it was clearly Parker and Stone processing their anger and frustration over losing Hayes to what they believed was Scientology's manipulation. The episode was also, in its own dark way, a tribute. At the very end, the boys stand around reflecting on Chef's legacy, and Kyle delivers a speech saying that they should not be mad at Chef for leaving. They should be mad at the fruity little club that scrambled his brains. This was Parker and Stone explicitly separating Hayes, the person who they loved, from the organization they believed had taken him away from them. They dedicated a later episode, the China Probrum, in Season 12, to Isaac Hayes after his death in 2008. The Return of Chef was not banned. It aired, it generated controversy, and it remains available. But it connects to the larger Scientology saga that included Trapped in the Closet, and it shows how the consequences of that controversy continued to ripple through the show for years after the initial episode aired. There is one more aspect of this entire story that deserves attention before we get to the closing, and that is the question of how the banned episodes have been handled in the streaming era. Because the landscape of how people watch television has changed dramatically since most of these controversies originally occurred, and the way the banned episodes have been treated across different platforms and distribution deals tells its own story about how the entertainment industry navigates sensitive content. When South Park first started getting into trouble with the Muhammad episodes in 2006, the primary way people watched television was still through traditional cable broadcast. If Comedy Central pulled an episode from reruns, that was essentially it. The episode was gone from the public eye unless you owned it on DVD. There was no streaming, there was no on-demand library where you could go back and watch whatever you wanted. If the network did not air it, you did not see it. But by 2014, the landscape had shifted. Hulu acquired streaming rights to South Park and made the show's extensive catalog available online. This was the first time most of the show's episodes were available in an easily accessible streaming format. But the 5 Muhammad episodes were not part of the Hulu deal. They were excluded from the start. Then, in June of 2020, HBO Max landed a massive deal worth $500 million to become the exclusive streaming home for South Park. This was one of the biggest streaming acquisitions for any animated property. HBO Max was paying an enormous amount of money for the right to host the show on their platform. And even with that much money on the table, the 5 Muhammad episodes were excluded. They were not part of the package. HBO Max did not get them, did not request them, and did not make any public effort to include them. When South Park eventually moved to Paramount Plus as its primary streaming home, the same exclusions carried over. The 5 episodes remain absent from the Paramount Plus library. They are also absent from the official South Park Studios website, which for years had been the go-to destination for fans who wanted to watch episodes for free online. The website streams every other episode of the show. Those 5 are simply not there. If you scroll through the episode list for Season 5, Super Best Friends is missing. If you look at Season 10, Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Part 2 are gone. If you check Season 14, episodes 200 and 201 do not exist. The physical media situation is slightly better, but only slightly. The Season 5 DVD set includes Super Best Friends in its original uncensored form because it was released before the episode was retroactively pulled. The Season 10 DVD set includes the Cartoon Wars episodes, though certain elements are censored. The Season 14 DVD and Blu-ray sets include 200 and 201, but these are the heavily censored versions that aired on Comedy Central. Muhammad's name is bleeped throughout. His image is covered by a black bar. The final speech in 201 remains completely muted. You can own these episodes on physical media, but what you own is an incomplete version of what Parker and Stone actually created. The uncensored versions, the versions where the speech is audible and the content is unaltered, do not exist in any commercially available format. And in certain international markets, even the censored versions are not available. The Region 4 DVD release, which covers Australia and surrounding territories, has omitted certain episodes entirely. In the United Kingdom, the availability of 200 and 201 on physical media has been inconsistent, with some releases including them and others leaving them out. This situation is essentially unique in modern television. There are very few examples of episodes of a major, long-running, currently airing television show being permanently and completely removed from commercial availability across all platforms simultaneously. Individual episodes get pulled occasionally for various reasons. There was controversy when certain episodes of shows like The Office, Scrubs, and 30 Rock were temporarily removed from streaming because they featured characters in blackface. But those removals were driven by internal corporate decisions about evolving social standards, not by external threats of violence. And in many cases, the episodes were eventually restored or remain available on physical media in their original form. The South Park situation is different because the suppression has been total, permanent, and driven by a combination of security concerns and the sheer institutional reluctance to revisit a controversy that could potentially reignite threats of violence. No one at Paramount or Comedy Central wants to be the executive who makes the decision to restore the Muhammad episodes and then has to deal with the consequences if that decision triggers a new round of threats. The path of least resistance is to simply leave the episodes in the vault and hope that people eventually stop asking about them, but people have not stopped asking. The banned episodes remain one of the most discussed and debated aspects of South Park's legacy. Online forums, Reddit threads, YouTube analysis videos, and entertainment journalism pieces regularly revisit the topic. Every time a new streaming deal is announced for South Park, one of the first questions that fans and journalists ask is whether the 5 Muhammad episodes will be included. The answer is always no, and every time that answer comes, it renews the conversation about whether the suppression is justified and how long it can or should continue. There is also the question of what happens to these episodes as time passes. The threats that prompted the censorship originated in 2010. That was over 15 years ago. The specific organization that made the threats, Revolution Muslim, has been dismantled. Its key figures have been prosecuted and imprisoned. The geopolitical landscape has shifted in countless ways since then. At what point, if ever, does the perceived risk of releasing these episodes drop below the threshold that would justify restoring them? Is it 10 years, 20, 50? Is there a specific event or condition that would need to occur before a network executive would feel comfortable putting them back online? Or has the institutional default become permanent suppression, regardless of whether the original threat still exists? These are questions that do not have easy answers, and the people who would need to make the decision, the executives at Paramount Global and Comedy Central, have shown no inclination to engage with them publicly. The episodes remain in limbo, not legally restricted, not court-ordered into suppression, not the subject of any ongoing legal action, just quietly, permanently, institutionally forgotten. Parker and Stone, for their part, have not made the restoration of these episodes a public cause. They have not launched campaigns or made public demands. Whether this is because they have accepted the situation, because they have moved on creatively, or because they believe that making a public fight out of it would only increase the risk to their safety and their colleagues' safety, is something only they know. What we do know is that they have continued to make South Park, continued to push boundaries, and continued to operate on the principle that everything is fair game, even while 5 episodes of their own show remain evidence that not everything is, in fact, fair game. If you are still with me, and I hope you are, thank you for listening to this whole journey. We have covered a lot of ground tonight. We have talked about 5 permanently banned episodes, international government bans in China, India, and Sri Lanka, death threats, network censorship, the loss of a beloved voice actor, and the ongoing battle between creative freedom and the forces that seek to limit it. But I want to close this video with something bigger. I want to talk about what all of this means and why the story of South Park's banned episodes is really a story about the most fundamental question in modern culture. That question is simple. Should there be limits on what comedy is allowed to say? And if so, who gets to decide where those limits are? When South Park first premiered in 1997, the show's approach to this question was unambiguous. There are no limits. Everything is fair game. Every religion, every politician, every celebrity, every cultural group, every belief system, every sacred cow. If it exists, it can be made fun of. Parker and Stone built their entire creative identity on that principle. It was not just a comedy strategy, it was a moral position. They genuinely believed that the moment you carve out exceptions, the moment you say this group is off limits or that subject cannot be touched, you have destroyed the entire foundation of free expression in comedy. Because if one exception can be made, then another can be demanded, and another, until the list of things you cannot joke about is longer than the list of things you can. For the first several years of the show's existence, this philosophy held up remarkably well. Christians were mocked and they complained, and the show kept going. Jews were mocked, and the audience, many of whom were Jewish, laughed along with it. Mormons got an entire episode explaining their beliefs with the running caption that this is what Mormons actually believed, and their response was largely one of good humor. Scientology was destroyed and trapped in the closet, and while the organization fought back through behind-the-scenes pressure and the manipulation of Isaac Hayes, the episode survived and is available today. Every major religion and belief system took its lumps on South Park, and every one of them responded within the normal bounds of public discourse. They wrote letters, they organized boycotts, they criticized the show in the media, they called for it to be canceled. These are all legitimate forms of protest. They are the tools of civil society. You see something you do not like and you use your voice to speak out against it. That is how it is supposed to work. The content creators make their art, the audience responds, and the marketplace of ideas sorts it out. But the Muhammad controversy broke that system. It broke it because the response went beyond the boundaries of civil discourse and into the territory of physical threats and the implied promise of lethal violence. When Revolution Muslim posted a message referencing the murder of Theo Van Gogh, when they included audio of a cleric calling for assassination, when they published the address of Parker and Stone's home, they introduced a variable into the equation that peaceful protest groups never did. They introduced fear, real fear, not the fear of bad publicity or lost advertisers or negative reviews. The fear of being killed, and that fear, worked. It is important to say that plainly. The fear worked. Comedy Central censored the episodes. The episodes were pulled from circulation. The content was permanently suppressed. And no one at the network faced any violence because the censorship prevented the situation from escalating further. From Comedy Central's perspective, the calculation was straightforward. They had a responsibility to the safety of their employees. Airing content that had been explicitly linked to threats of murder was a risk they were not willing to take. You can argue about whether that calculation was correct, but you cannot deny that it was understandable. No television executive wants to be the person who got their staff killed over a cartoon. But from Parker and Stone's perspective, the calculation looked very different. They saw a world where every other religion was treated equally, where Christians and Jews and Mormons and Scientologists all got the same irreverent treatment, and where one single exception was being carved out. Not because that religion was more deserving of respect, but because the people defending it were willing to be more violent. The lesson being taught was that peaceful protest gets you nothing and violent threats get you everything. And Parker and Stone found that lesson to be deeply dangerous, because if that lesson takes hold, then every group that wants special treatment just needs to be scary enough to demand it. The Cartoon Wars episodes in 2006 were Parker and Stone's first attempt to address this dynamic on screen. Kyle's argument in those episodes was that if one group can use fear to silence criticism, then free speech for everyone is dead. It is a domino argument. You let one group shut you up through threats, and the next group will try the same thing, and the next. And eventually, the only things you are allowed to say are the things that no one finds offensive, which in practice means you cannot say anything meaningful at all. Episodes 200 and 201 were their second and more ambitious attempt. They did not just argue about censorship abstractly, they demonstrated it in real time. They wrote a speech about standing up to intimidation and fear, and they had that speech censored by their own network. The irony was not lost on anyone. The episode about censorship was itself censored. The argument for free speech was silenced. The message about not giving into fear was erased because the network was afraid. And the consequence of that censorship extends far beyond South Park itself. The 5 Muhammad episodes that are currently banned from all streaming platforms represent something larger than just missing television content. They represent a precedent. They demonstrate that in the modern media landscape, violent threats can successfully suppress creative expression permanently and completely. Those episodes have been gone for over 15 years now. There's no indication that they will ever return. No streaming platform has shown any interest in restoring them. No one at Comedy Central or Paramount has publicly pushed for their reinstatement. They are simply gone, as if they never existed. Think about what that means for a moment. A television show that has been running for nearly 30 years, that has produced over 300 episodes, that has taken on every powerful institution in America, has a permanent hole in its catalog. 5 episodes that the creators made, that the network aired, that the audience watched, that are part of the show's history and artistic legacy, are inaccessible to anyone who wants to watch them through legitimate means. They exist in a void. You can read about them. You can find descriptions of what happened in them, but you cannot see them. The actual content, the actual art, the actual arguments that Parker and Stone were making has been removed from public access. And the reason it has been removed is not that the content was illegal. It is not that a court ordered it suppressed. It is not that any law was broken. The reason is that a small number of people made threats, and the institutions responsible for distributing the content decided that the risk was not worth it. The marketplace of ideas did not reject those episodes. Fear rejected them. Now, to be fair to the other side of this argument, there are people who believe that Parker and Stone went too far. There are people who believe that depicting the Prophet Muhammad, even in a satirical context, is inherently disrespectful to over 1 billion Muslims worldwide, the vast majority of whom would never threaten anyone with violence. The argument goes that just because you can do something does not mean you should, and that deliberately creating content that you know will deeply offend a large portion of the world's population is not brave or principled, it is just needlessly provocative. This is a perspective that deserves genuine consideration because the people who hold it are not extremists. They are not the people who made death threats. They are ordinary people who believe that their faith deserves a basic level of respect and who feel hurt and marginalized when something sacred to them is used as a punchline on a late-night cartoon. The vast, overwhelming majority of Muslims around the world responded to the South Park episodes not with violence or threats, but with disappointment, frustration, and the same kind of complaint letters and boycott campaigns that every other offended group has used throughout the show's history. The Council on American Islamic Relations, one of the largest Muslim advocacy organizations in the United States, specifically declined to issue a formal statement about the 200 episodes, saying they did not want to draw more attention to the show. Their response was measured, deliberate, and entirely within the bounds of civil discourse. They did exactly what a responsible advocacy organization is supposed to do. The problem is that their measured response was overshadowed entirely by the extreme response of a tiny fringe group. Revolution Muslim, according to multiple law enforcement assessments, had no more than about a dozen active members. They were described by the FBI and the NYPD as being all talk and never having engaged in actual violence. They were, by every meaningful measure, a marginal organization with virtually no real-world power or influence. And yet their website post, their invocation of Theo Van Gogh's murder, their distribution of Parker and Stone's home address, was enough to permanently alter the trajectory of one of the most successful television shows in American history. A handful of people with a website successfully censored a show watched by millions. That disproportion is staggering when you think about it. And this is where the debate gets genuinely complicated, because there are two things that can be true at the same time. It can be true that the vast majority of Muslims were unfairly represented by the actions of Revolution Muslim, and that the censorship was a response to an extreme fringe that does not speak for the broader community. And it can also be true that the censorship set a precedent that is genuinely harmful to free expression, because it demonstrated that a small number of people willing to make threats can achieve what millions of people engaged in peaceful protest could not. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and navigating between them is one of the great challenges of living in a diverse, pluralistic society where different values and sensitivities collide. Parker and Stone have heard this argument many times, and their response has been consistent. They do not single out Islam for mockery. They mock all religions equally. The same episodes that depict Muhammad also depict Jesus watching pornography and Buddha using drugs. If the standard is that you should not make fun of things that people hold sacred, then South Park should not exist at all, because everything is sacred to someone. Christians find the depiction of Jesus in those episodes deeply offensive. Buddhists find the depiction of Buddha offensive. The difference is not in the level of offense, the difference is in the response. And Parker and Stone's position is that the response should not determine the treatment. There's also a broader cultural dimension to this debate that extends well beyond South Park. The question of whether Western media should apply different standards to the depiction of different religions based on the potential consequences has been debated in newsrooms, editorial boards, university lecture halls, and government chambers around the world ever since the Islands Posten controversy in 2005. Some argue for what they call responsible self-restraint, the idea that knowing something will cause great offense and potentially endanger lives is reason enough not to do it, even if you have the legal right to do so. Others argue that this is simply surrender dressed up in the language of sensitivity, that accepting limitations on expression based on who will be most offended and most dangerous creates a hierarchy of respect that has nothing to do with actual respect and everything to do with fear. This debate has played out far beyond the world of animation. Charlie Hebdo, the French satirical magazine, published cartoons of Muhammad in 2012 and again in 2015. On January 7, 2015, 2 gunmen forced their way into the Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris and killed 12 people, including 8 cartoonists and editors. That attack was a horrific escalation from threats to actual lethal violence, and it sent shockwaves through the global media industry. The phrase "Je suis Charlie" became an international rallying cry for free expression. And yet, even after the attack, many media organizations chose not to republish the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, citing concerns about safety and sensitivity. The debate that Parker and Stone had been forcing through South Park was not an abstract philosophical exercise. It was a life and death question that claimed real victims in the real world. The fact that South Park's banned episodes exist in the same historical context as the Charlie Hebdo attack gives the entire story a gravity that goes beyond entertainment industry drama. When we talk about the 5 episodes that you cannot watch, we are not just talking about missing cartoon content. We are talking about one front in a much larger global struggle over the boundaries of free expression, the limits of religious sensitivity, and the question of whether violence or the threat of violence should ever be allowed to determine what can and cannot be said in a free society. This is a genuine moral debate, and reasonable people can disagree about where the line should be drawn. But the factual reality of what happened is not debatable. South Park mocked every religion. Only one group responded with death threats. Only the episodes involving that group were permanently suppressed. Whether you think that outcome is justified or tragic or somewhere in between, the facts are the facts. Let us now take a step back and look at the full timeline of everything we have discussed tonight, because seeing it all laid out in chronological order really drives home how this story unfolded over the years. What started as a single, unremarkable episode in 2001 grew into a 15-year saga that touched every corner of the entertainment industry and raised questions about the nature of free expression that still do not have satisfying answers. It started on August 13, 1997, when South Park premiered on Comedy Central. The show was controversial from day one. It was the first weekly program to carry a TVMA rating. It immediately began generating complaints from parents' groups, religious organizations, and media watchdogs. But the controversy only made it more popular. Within a year, Comedy Central's subscriber base had exploded from 9 million to 50 million households. The show was a cultural phenomenon, and it was just getting started. On July 4th, 2001, the Super Best Friends episode aired. Muhammad was depicted openly as a member of a superhero team alongside other religious figures. No one complained, no one threatened anyone. The episode aired in reruns for years without incident. On September 30th, 2005, the Jyllands-Posten newspaper in Denmark published 12 cartoons depicting Muhammad. The result was global protests, embassy attacks, riots, and over 200 deaths. The world changed. The rules around depicting Muhammad shifted from cultural sensitivity to physical danger. On November 16, 2005, Trapped in the Closet aired, taking on Scientology. Tom Cruise locked himself in a literal closet. The beliefs of Scientology were laid out on screen with the caption, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." The episode set off a chain of events that would lead to Isaac Hayes' departure, the pulled rebroadcast, and the Closet Gate scandal. In January of 2006, Isaac Hayes suffered a stroke that left him unable to speak. On March 13, 2006, a statement was released in his name announcing that he was leaving South Park. His son would later reveal that the statement was not written by Hayes and that Scientology associates quit the show on his behalf while he was incapacitated. Hayes died on August 10, 2008. On April 5th and 12th, 2006, Cartoon Wars. Part 1 and Part 2 aired. Parker and Stone attempted to show Muhammad. Comedy Central refused and inserted a black title card declaring that they would not broadcast the image. The hypocrisy of censoring Muhammad while showing Jesus and Buddha in offensive contexts was the entire point of the episodes, and the network proved the creators' argument by actually doing it. Both episodes were later removed from streaming platforms as part of the HBO Max exclusion. On December 7, 2005, the Bloody Mary episode aired, depicting the Virgin Mary bleeding from her rear end. The Catholic League organized a major protest campaign. The episode was pulled from broadcast in New Zealand but remained on the air in the United States. It is available on streaming today. On April 14th and 21st, 2010, episodes 200 and 201 aired. They brought back dozens of past celebrities and storylines, centered the plot around an attempt to bring Muhammad to South Park, and culminated in a speech about standing up to intimidation that was completely bleeped out by Comedy Central. Revolution Muslim posted threats referencing the murder of Theo Van Gogh and included the home address of Parker and Stone. The NYPD increased security at Comedy Central headquarters. Zachary Adam Chesser was later sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Both episodes were permanently pulled from all platforms. The Super Best Friends episode from 2001 was retroactively pulled as well. On October 2, 2019, Banned in China aired, criticizing Chinese government censorship and Hollywood's self-censorship to appease Chinese authorities. China responded by scrubbing the entire South Park franchise from all Chinese internet platforms. Parker and Stone issued their famous mock apology. The episode remains available on all Western platforms. In July of 2025, Parker and Stone signed a $1.5 billion extension deal to continue making South Park through at least 2030. 28 seasons, 338 episodes, 5 permanently banned from all streaming, 1 permanently banned in China. The show keeps going. That is the timeline. That is the story. And what strikes me about it, looking at it all laid out like this, is how consistent Parker and Stone have been through every single chapter. Their position has not changed. They believe that everyone gets treated equally, that no group deserves special protection from satire, and that fear should never be the reason content is suppressed. They have held that position through death threats, through government bans, through the loss of a beloved colleague, through network censorship, and through billion-dollar business deals. They have been told to stop, and they have not stopped. They have been told to apologize, and they have not apologized. They have been told that what they are doing is dangerous, and they have kept doing it. Whether you admire that stubbornness or find it reckless depends entirely on where you stand in the debate about the limits of comedy. But there is something undeniably compelling about 2 guys from Colorado who started by making a Christmas card with construction paper cutouts, who built that card into one of the most successful animated franchises in television history, and who, after nearly 3 decades and over 300 episodes, still refuse to accept that any subject is off limits. The banned episodes are a stain on the show's legacy in one sense. They represent the moments where the system broke down, where the forces of censorship won, where the content was permanently suppressed despite the creators' objections. But in another sense, they are a testament to how far the show has pushed the boundaries of what is possible on television. The fact that only 5 episodes out of over 300 have been successfully pulled from circulation means that South Park has gotten away with an extraordinary amount of controversial content over the years. The show has survived everything that has been thrown at it, and it is still standing, still producing new episodes, still generating controversy, and still forcing conversations that nobody else on television is willing to have. The 5 Muhammad episodes remain unavailable on every major streaming platform. They are not in Paramount Plus. They are not on the official South Park website. They were excluded from the HBO Max deal. The censored versions on DVD are incomplete shadows of what Parker and Stone actually created. If you want to understand the full story of South Park's battle with censorship, you can read about it, you can listen to people describe it, but you cannot watch the actual episodes themselves. The art has been removed from public access, and there is no indication that it will ever return. Parker and Stone know this. They have lived with it for over 15 years. In July of 2025, rather than winding the show down, they signed a $1.5 billion extension deal with Paramount Global to keep making South Park through at least 2030. That is not the decision of creators who are worn down or defeated. That is the decision of people who still believe the show has something to say and an audience that wants to hear it. They did not make the deal contingent on the restoration of the banned episodes. They did not demand that Paramount put the Muhammad episodes back on streaming as part of the negotiation. They just kept moving forward. And that is probably the most Parker and Stone response possible. They fought, they lost on this particular battle, and they kept going. They did not retire in protest. They did not make a public stand demanding the restoration of the banned episodes. They just kept making the show, kept pushing buttons, kept going after powerful targets, and kept trusting that the audience would show up. The audience has shown up. Season 27 pulled the biggest premiere numbers the show had seen in over 2 decades. The $1.5 billion deal guarantees that the show will keep going for years to come. The banned episodes are a wound, but they are not a fatal one. South Park was born from a crude construction paper video of Jesus fighting Santa Claus. It grew into a 300-plus episode television juggernaut that changed the way animated comedy works. It has won Emmy Awards. It has been nominated for the biggest prizes in television. It has inspired a Broadway musical that won 9 Tony Awards. It has generated billions of dollars in revenue. It has been watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. And it has been banned, censored, protested, threatened, and suppressed more times than any other animated show in television history. Through all of it, Trey Parker and Matt Stone have maintained the same position they started with. Everyone gets treated equally. No exceptions, no sacred cows. And the response to that position from the rest of the world has ranged from enthusiastic agreement to angry protest to violent threats to government censorship. Every possible reaction on the spectrum, South Park has received it. And the show is still here. The banned episodes are the price that was paid for that uncompromising approach. Whether the price was too high or not high enough depends on who you ask. But the episodes exist, even if you cannot watch them. The arguments they contained exist, even if they were bleeped and censored and removed from circulation. The point they were trying to make, that fear should not dictate what can and cannot be said, exists, even though fear is exactly what silenced them. And there is something deeply ironic and deeply sad about that. The episodes about censorship were censored. The message about not giving into intimidation was erased because of intimidation. The argument that no group should receive special treatment from satire was proven correct by the very act of giving one group special treatment. Everything Parker and Stone were trying to say in those episodes was validated by what happened to them. The episodes made their point, just not in the way the creators intended. I think about that sometimes. I think about the fact that somewhere in a vault, or on a hard drive, or in the Comedy Central archives, the uncensored versions of those episodes exist. The speech that was bleeped out was actually written and recorded. The images that were covered with black bars were actually animated. The content that was suppressed was actually created. It is real. It exists. And it has been locked away for over 15 years because the people who control its distribution decided that the risk of releasing it was too great. Maybe one day the climate will change. Maybe one day the threat will have receded far enough that someone at Paramount or Comedy Central will decide the time is right to release the uncensored episodes. Maybe one day you will be able to stream Super Best Friends, Cartoon Wars Part 1 and 2, and episodes 200 and 201 the way Parker and Stone intended them to be seen. But that day is not today. And based on everything we know, it is not coming anytime soon. For now, the banned episodes of South Park exist as ghosts. Referenced but not seen, discussed but not watched, known about but not accessible. They are the most famous pieces of television that you cannot legally view anywhere in the world. And the story of how they came to be banned is, in many ways, the story of the limits of free expression in the 21st century. South Park is still going, Trey Parker and Matt Stone are still making new episodes, the show is still generating controversy, and somewhere in the background, 5 episodes sit in the dark, waiting for a world brave enough to let them back into the light. They have been waiting for 15 years. They will probably wait for many more. And maybe that is the final lesson of this entire story. South Park has always been about testing limits, about seeing how far you can push, about refusing to accept that any subject is too dangerous to touch. For over 300 episodes, the show won that game. It pushed and the world pushed back, but the show kept going. Then it ran into the one limit it could not overcome. Not because the comedy was not sharp enough, not because the argument was not valid enough, but because the cost of crossing that particular line was measured not in angry emails and canceled advertisers, but in the actual potential for human beings to lose their lives. That was the line that held. And the episodes that tried to cross it are still behind it, locked away where they cannot cause the kind of harm that the people who threatened Parker and Stone said they would cause. Whether those episodes should stay locked away or be released to the public is a question that every person watching this video can answer for themselves. There is no objectively correct position. There is only the ongoing tension between the right to speak freely and the responsibility to consider the consequences of what you say. South Park has spent nearly 30 years living in that tension. The banned episodes are where the tension finally broke. That is the full story of the banned episodes of South Park. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel. It is completely free, and it really does make a difference. We put a lot of research and effort into these videos, and every subscriber helps us justify doing more of them. Drop a comment below and let me know what you thought. Did Parker and Stone go too far? Should the episodes be restored, or is the censorship justified? I genuinely want to hear your perspective on this because it is one of those topics where good people can land on completely different sides of the argument and both be making valid points. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and I will see